Today we're looking at the third section of Chapter 2, Deep Ocean Basins. And first we need to just point out that all the oceans are connected into what we call the world ocean, and of course it dominates our planet in terms of 71% of the total area. But when we look at the world ocean, we can divide it into four large basins. We have the Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, and Arctic. And that's the order of size, Pacific being the largest and Arctic being the smallest. Now, below 60 degrees south latitude is considered the Southern Ocean. If you look on a globe, you'll see the 60-degree south latitude line, and everything below that is regarded as the Southern Ocean, which is mostly parts Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian. But it is considerably different in temperature, waves, and the currents that flow through it. Here you see the location of the oceans, Arctic being around the North Pole, and the southern is around Antarctica. This chart gives you the depths, the volume, and the surface area. And again, the Pacific beats them all quite handily. It is twice the size of the Atlantic just in sheer volume. One thing that's interesting about the Southern Ocean is that on the chart there you'll see that its average depth is not calculated because we have not mapped enough of it to come up with an average depth. All right, so when the ocean crust meets the continental crust, it's called the continental margin, and there's three general parts to it. So you see where the continental crust is meeting the oceanic crust, there's three big parts. The first part is the continental shelf, which is the beginning of the continental margin, and then there's a drop off where the downward slide of the continent is called the continental slope, and then at the very bottom where it meets the bottom of the ocean, the bottom of the slope meets the flat part of the ocean is called the continental rise. Before we talk about each one of those, though, there is something called the intertidal zone. If you've ever been to the beach at all and stood there, you've been in the intertidal zone. It's the area between high tide and low tide. And in this picture, you can see it's quite substantial, the difference between the high tide and the low tide. And the first picture that on top shows low tide, where there's no water at all for quite a ways. And then this bottom picture shows high tide, where the water comes all the way and reaches the wall. On our beaches here in South Florida, the difference in our high and low tide is not that significant. Now, if you're an organism and you live in the intertidal zone, then you have to have some special adaptations because half of your life you are exposed to air. So part of your day you're going to be exposed to air, part of your day you're going to be underwater. So you have to have some special adaptations. And we'll get into that later, but the intertidal zone is the first section there on the beach. Then if you begin to walk out into the water, you're walking on the continental shelf. The continental shelf is the part that reaches out. It's pretty straight, although it does go downhill. You may not notice it because what you notice is the waves are getting higher and higher. But really what's happening is your shelf is going downhill slightly, and it can go quite a ways out. It can go up from 1 kilometer all the way to 750 kilometers, depending on which continent we're talking about. It is the richest area of the ocean in terms of the number of species or biodiversity. Think about the coral reefs and all the creatures that live and visit the coral reef. So when you think about all of that, it gets the designated richest area. Now, where does the shelf end? Where the shelf ends and drops off, it's called the shelf break or the drop-off. And that can be underwater anywhere from 120 to 400 meters down. So when you look at this particular picture here, you can see this shelf actually goes quite a bit downhill. A lot of shelves are more flat than this, but that's where the concentration of life is. Now, the continental slope is kind of the edge of the continent. It's where the shelf break or drop-off starts, and the continent slopes all the way down to the deep sea floor. The continental slope, as you see in this picture, is much steeper than the continental shelf, and the continental rise, which is the last part, right where the oceanic and continental crust meet, is the continental rise. This is formed by sediments that have been pushed down from the continental shelf and slope. So think about, it's kind of like the slope is a big slide, and sediment and debris and rocks and all kinds of stuff, you know, they work their way down the slope and end up at the bottom, and they create a little raised area there, or what we call the continental rise. It's kind of like an underwater river delta where all the sediment ends up. So here we see all three areas, including the flat part of the ocean bottom, which is called the abyssal plain. But I want you to focus on this part here where the sediment builds up and causes the continental rise. Okay, before we get to the bottom of the ocean, the very bottom, let's talk about active and passive margins. Coasts that have geological activity, like earthquakes, volcanoes, and trenches, are what we call active margins, and they typically have steep rocky shorelines. Their continental shelves don't extend very far, and they have steep continental slopes. So an example would be the west coast of the United States, California, Washington, Oregon. All of those are part of the west coast, and that is what we call an active margin. There's geological activity, rocky shores, the continental shelf does not extend out that far before it drops off, as opposed to the east coast where we live and all the way up, pretty much, we are relatively inactive geologically. We have wide, flat coastal plains, wide continental shelves, gradually sloping continental slopes, and not just the east coast of the United States, but also the east coast of South America. And so that also means that the west coast of South America is an active margin. And here's an example, or a picture kind of showing that on the Pacific side of South America. That's the active margin. That's where you had the Sandown Andes Mountains being formed as the Nazca Plate subducts under the Atlantic Plate. On the eastern side of South America, there's no subduction happening. It's a passive margin. You have a wider continental shelf, a more gentle slope on your continental slope, and you have a continental rise at the bottom right before the abyssal plain starts. But on the active side, on the Pacific side, you do have a trench. So this just kind of sums that up a little bit. And what's interesting to note is that the active margins make this circular, they kind of rim the Pacific Ocean all the way around, and that's known as the Ring of Fire, because that's where we get most volcanoes and earthquakes. All right, so let's go to the bottom of the ocean now. On the deep sea floor, which is known as the abyssal plain, there's some different features we'll look at here. How deep is that? Well, the average depth is about 4,000 meters. The average depth of the deep sea floor. So that means that over 50% of our planet is underwater and in darkness. But there are some features down there we want to mention. So there's some hills, there could be plateaus, there could be rises, there could be volcanic islands, and there could be submarine volcanoes, also known as seamounts. So this would be, let's see right here. So these little mountains here would be your seamounts. But once they actually break the surface of the water, they're called volcanic islands. And over here on the right, this would be a passive margin. You have a trench, not a very wide continental shelf. And this side would be your passive margin with a wider continental shelf, a more gentle continental slope, and a continental rise. Now, in the middle there you saw the mid-ocean ridge. And that, of course, is where the plates are pulling apart, where the seafloor is spreading. And in that rift valley, we have discovered, and you saw the video, hydrothermal vents. And hydrothermal vents were surprisingly rich in marine life. And these deep sea vent communities were discovered first by Robert Ballard, as you heard in the video, in the Galapagos Rift. The primary producers in those ecosystems are chemosynthetic bacteria, which I've never even heard of before. They're not making photosynthesis from the sun. There is no sunlight. They're making food from the chemicals that come out of these hydrothermal vents. So these are called black smokers because they have minerals dissolved in them that give it that dark color. Sometimes they're white smokers, sometimes they're clear. Just depends on what is dissolved in the water. But it's water that's coming out superheated from being down underneath. Things that they did see were red-tipped tube worms, ghostly fish, strange shrimp with eyes on their backs, giant crabs, spot lobsters, etc. All right, thank you very much.